Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm Deb Fellman, your host for today's show. My guest today, Max Eden, is on his way. He got caught up in a meeting, so I'm going to introduce him, and when he arrives, he will be joining us. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Max Eden is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education reform, specifically K-12 and early childhood education. Before rejoining AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. In addition to a number of reports and studies on education, Mr. Eden is the co-author of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller, Why Meadow Died: The People and Politics That Created the Parkland Shooter and Endanger America's Students. He's also the co-editor with Frederick Hess of the Every Student Succeeds Act, What It Means for School Systems and States, and I'm definitely going to ask him about that today. And he has testified about school violence before Congress and about the school to prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So you can read his writings in Newsweek and National Review, New York Daily News, New York Post, the Baltimore Sun, The Hill, the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is an expert on all these topics. And I hope that we will have time to get into a lot of these issues today. So he has arrived, and let us welcome Max Eden.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. I just did a whole introduction and set it up for people, who you are, about your books. And so hopefully we can get into some things. I'm trying to figure out if I want to just like throw this over to you to talk about what you think we should be talking about right now, or if I should fire some questions at you that I've had for a while. So how do you want to?
Let's start with you firing some questions, and then I can
Okay.
probably work my way towards towards
Okay.
saying things through them.
Fair enough. All right. One thing that I've learned doing the work that I've been doing is not a lot of parents, in fact, almost none, know what ESSA is.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't really understand what it did to our public schools. They don't really understand what it is. They don't understand the importance of it. And so I thought maybe you could just give us a quick and nerdy about what is ESSA and why do parents need to understand what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a much stranger story than I think I even appreciated when I edited that book at the time, because there ends up being a pretty substantial difference between what, in my opinion, now in 2022 versus in 2015, a pretty substantial difference between what people thought ESSA was and was supposed to do and what it has ended up doing. What it was supposed to do is something that at the time I was very sympathetic towards. I think you probably would have been sympathetic towards at the time, right? Because we went through this No Child Left Behind era where where the first time in history there were federal requirements on testing and reading and math and accountability attached to that. So this, had some merit and also did a lot of unintended things, right? It was accused, not unreasonably, of narrowing instruction, hyper-focusing schools on reading and math. And it had this component that said, every school will be 100% proficient or make adequate yearly progress towards 100% proficiency in reading and math by 2014, which is one of those pie-in-the-sky things that you think, how does it actually make into federal law? These people are out to lunch, but these people thought that it would be fixed before then, right? That it's usually been authorized at a pretty regular interval, I think every 5 to 8 years. And so in 2001, they didn't really think 2014 would come before we visited. But it did come, and it came during the Obama administration, where because all of these schools were approaching 100%, or were approaching the year in which they were supposed to be 100% proficient, and were not going to be, more and more and more, and inevitably, eventually, almost every single school district in America would be running afoul of this law and be facing the teeth of the federal accountability system. And this is a very undesirable position for anybody. And what the Obama administration decided to do with that was to use waivers from No Child Left Behind that were kind of conditional. So basically, the beginning of Obama, you had Race to the Top. They dangled a lot of federal money out for schools and said, hey, we know your budgets are hurting. If you want this money, you can get it in a competitive grant form if you have high and common standards and assessments tied to those standards, read the Common Core. So the Common Core was put into schools kind of through this roundabout, frankly, somewhat sneaky federal carrot, as were test-based teacher evaluations and a handful of other such policies. And then as the backlash started, the waivers came in, and the Obama administration said, well, your schools could all be, failing, or, if you keep on doing all the things we want you to do and do a couple other things, then your schools won't be failing. We'll give you a waiver. This was not an anticipated use of the waiver power. It was, and it's a big word, but I'm speaking kind of more philosophically than, in a partisan way. It's kind of tyrannical, right?
Right.
Using a law that was not supposed to be used that way to say, do what I want or else bad things will happen, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So what you had from really, 2010, 2011 through 2015 was a massive populist backlash from the right and the left. I mean, in kind of an embryonic version of what we're seeing right now play out with critical race theory and social emotional learning. And back then it was the Common Core. The right didn't like it because it wasn't done right. It was an affront to federalism. It was an affront to the separation of powers. And also there was a suspicion that I think is, proven to be more well-founded than some people thought at the time, that this might be kind of a Trojan horse for all sorts of other things that we have a hard time following and expecting exactly. The left didn't like it. The teachers' unions actually, they hated it. They turned on it and they had a very good grievance against it, because they're like, wait, you're evaluating our teachers to teach to tests aligned with standards that we haven't been trained in? This is wrong. So both the left and the right united to pass the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was, billed at the time, and I certainly thought of it at the time as a substantial devolution of federal power. The Wall Street Journal actually wrote an editorial calling it the greatest devolution of federal power in the past quarter century. And this was, what I thought that it was at the time, what I thought the most important aspects of it were at the time, why I was so supportive of it at the time. But the more time goes on, the more, one realizes, and I fear I might struggle to explain precisely what I mean, but one realizes that what really happened between No Child Left Behind, the waivers, and Race to the Top, and what was not actually stopped through ESSA, and in some ways continues through it in ways that I hadn't expected, was that the letter of federal law matters less than ways in which federal law opens up schools, all but sometimes requires schools to contract out with vendors who will push things that many of the architects of the law probably didn't anticipate at the time, but is there nonetheless. And so, operationally, ESSA is the federal law that governs K-12 education, but also operationally, K-12 education is arguably not really governed by a federal law at all. It is rather governed by a series of interest groups that leverage aspects of federal law, aspects of state law, regulatory action as pretexts to push products into schools in a way that is even hard for me to keep full track of.
Right. Now, was it ESSA that was sort of the gateway for an equity plan for every school? As I understood it, like the Obama administration attached at some point, and I thought it was to ESSA, but maybe it was to something else. They put in a requirement that in order to get your funds, like if you wanted to be, getting the money that came with this, you had to submit an equity plan. You had to have a plan that would, check off a bunch of boxes as far as what they were calling equity. It included things like reducing the number of suspensions, making sure there wasn't disparity based on race, increasing the number of minority teachers. So they had this notion of equity that was race-based, first of all, and that tied to certain performance metrics that were about staffing and discipline. Was that part of that or something separate?
Mostly separate, but not necessarily entirely disconnected.
Okay. But I know it was an Obama era thing that has carried over to now.
That's entirely accurate. That was the bigger locus of that was in my assessment. The bigger locus of that was not ESSA itself, because the Obama administration didn't have that much time to regulate ESSA. In fact, many of the regulations it tried to put onto ESSA were reversed by Congress when President Trump got in. And there might have been some things in the law that, kind of firmed that up. I honestly can't recall precisely what it was. I don't think it's the biggest part of the story. The biggest part of the story was, and now again is, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and especially vis-a-vis school discipline, but school discipline in some ways as a gateway drug to the things that you're discussing. It wasn't that you need to do these things to get this money. It was that if you don't do what we want to do, we'll take your money away from you.
Right.
And so what they did on school discipline, for example, is they changed the enforcement standard for civil rights from disparate treatment to disparate impact. So before, the idea was, if a Black student and a white student both swear at a teacher and the white student gets a detention and the Black student gets expelled, and they're otherwise, they otherwise behave similarly before, that's racist, that's discriminatory. There deserves to be a federal civil rights backstop to protect a student from being treated differently because of his race.
Sure.
But when they changed it from disparate impact or disparate treatment, the standard effectively became, and people could quibble, but it's basically, if two Black students and one white student all swear at a teacher and they all get suspended for it equally, it may or may not be a civil rights violation depending on the racial composition of the school district. They basically took facial disparities in school discipline data, and there are disparities in school discipline, right? It's about 3-to-1 African American to white. Of course, far more white students than Asian students get suspended as well. But basically, if school districts had these disparities, they were put on notice that they might be subject to investigations, which were not really investigations because they didn't really come through to conclusions of facts. They just kind of harassed school districts and would only stop harassing school districts when school districts agreed to adopt a slew of policies that they wanted to adopt, particularly restorative justice. Some equity consultancy stuff was in there, to my recollection. And so about 300 to 350, it's hard to count precisely, school districts, but serving about 10 million students were directly investigated by OCR, changed their discipline policy because of OCR. And many other school districts did it not because of direct coercion, but because the moral framework around education was redone by the policy arguments, right? The policy argument became, in a way that's now more recognizable to people, as kind of proto-critical race theory. Disparities of discrimination, and we know how to fix discrimination. And we fix discrimination by being anti-racist. And so the whole restorative justice thing, it wasn't really in public education before the Obama administration. By the time it ended, it was in, to my recollection, at least a majority of districts, and it has only grown since.
Right.
And there was actually an Education Week article, I think that came out last week, about the Durham Public School District, which is going really heavy on equity consulting, DEI, et cetera. And it pointed out that the root of their current equity push actually stemmed from, I think, a 2012 OCR investigation into the school district. And I monitored this kind of as it was unfolding during the time, and my recollection is that arrests actually went way up in Durham public schools, which is something that you would kind of expect to see. If teachers can't discipline a student, if they can't give a student detention and a suspension, if they can't do the kind of low-level discipline work that teachers are used to doing, well, then problems are going to escalate and somebody's going to have to take care of them. And in Durham, as I recall, ended up being the police more often than not. But of course, what actually happens because of these equity policies never really matters, right? Because if your theory of action is that we see these statistical disparities, this is evidence of racism, we're going to fix racism, how do you ever come back from that? How do you ever think, oh, well, maybe it wasn't racism and maybe we don't know how to fix it? You just keep pushing forward and forward and forward. And
we need to do it more. We need to just do more of the thing that isn't working, because
it's entirely unfalsifiable, and failure is only ever taken as proof that more is needed,
that you could use that one phrase to sum up all of American education, though. It
Much,
kind of
much.
doesn't, it
I
doesn't
don't
really
know that I
matter.
want to concede all, but much.
Yeah, a whole lot, a whole lot. So, why we're still using Lucy Calkins to teach reading is beyond my comprehension, but apparently we aren't using it hard enough. So, anyway, so that kind of segues into the book you wrote about Parkland, right? I mean, weren't those policies, help us understand, and again, we should read the book, but the some of these policies, they create sort of perverse incentives, don't they?
Oh, 100%, right? I mean,
Okay, so
so let's say that you're a school and you're a principal, right? And the district tells you, hey, our district has these disparities, you have these disparities, you need to fix these disparities. And we are
mhm,
going to reduce suspensions, we are going to reduce arrests, and this is going to lead to social justice. If you are a good principal operating within this system, you're going to do what you're told somehow, right? And
right.
if lowering suspensions, lowering arrests, if doing restorative justice interventions don't actually work, well, you're still expected to deliver the results you're expected to deliver. You're still expected to get these numbers down. And these numbers can go down either by total failure to enforce rules or by hiding the enforcement of rules when you enforce them. So you either don't do it or you take it off the books. And Broward County, Florida, the school district wherein the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and the shooting occurred, was in many ways the nation's leader in this. They were the only only major school district that I could find for relative certainty that did these policies without being pressured by the federal Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to do these policies. And there's an interesting backstory. The superintendent was best friends, good close colleagues with Arnie Duncan. Kind of, you look at it and you can't help but think this was to some degree coordinated. The Broward County model, the Promise program in particular, was touted as a national model as these policies were expanded kind of behind the scenes, but also eventually in front of the scenes very aggressively across the country. The Promise program itself, which was the locus of a lot of the particular kind of debate and controversy, was on the law enforcement side. It basically gave students 3 free misdemeanors every year. So you could only
No
really be
moral hazard there at all.
no moral hazard there. No, and the school district's policies on paper were so extreme that if you were a rapist or had committed a murder, you could get back into the public school system after, to my recollection, 90 to 180 days at an alternative education center. But of course, alternative education centers were themselves, especially in the special ed side, kind of indirectly but aggressively downsized, because the assumption is that you should not be excluding students with disabilities. You should be including students with disabilities, which sounds very nice, and I'm sure in many cases is the right thing to do. But one case in which I'm not at all convinced it's the right thing to do is students who have an emotional and behavioral disorder, students who are special ed because of their bad behavior, which the
Like
Park
Nick
shooter,
Cruz.
yep, which he was. And so you have an individual like him going through a system, and we could talk for hours about it, and a lot of but an individual who could not possibly have given any clearer evidence about who he was and what he wanted to do. And at every step through the system, the incentive was, let's keep him in a normal school, let's get him back into a normal school, and let's cover up his misbehavior as much as possible. And so the whole debate went to gun control, right? And I'm an education guy, I'm not a gun guy, I don't really have a dog in that fight, but you couldn't really help but notice that, if he had been arrested for things that he had done that were arrest worthy, either at a felony or a misdemeanor level, it could have prohibited him from legally buying a gun, or at least flagged the application. But those
Sure.
things couldn't happen. And possibly more importantly, he didn't get the help that he needed. He
Right.
wasn't a student who should have been in a normal school. He was a student who should have been in a
Right.
special
So
ed.
even without the guns, he might have resorted to knives, or he might have resorted to explosives, or, I mean, we're talking about a very troubled young man.
Yeah, and
And
allegedly, according to students, he brought knives to school and he brought bullets to school. And this is something that was said to me many times by students. This is something that there's no record of in his disciplinary record, which I reviewed, In fact, in his first semester back at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, the story that I was told, and it checks out with the facts that I found, was that I think I'm recalling this perfectly. I might be slightly mistaken. It's been a couple of years, but the only time that he was disciplined was a day in which the traditional assistant principal charged with disciplining him was actually off campus.
Wow.
And that wasn't a mistake. It went to another assistant principal, as I believe, and the other assistant principal put something in the disciplinary record. And then there's an open question of just how much bad stuff did he do? And I couldn't quite ever put that together, because you hear a lot of stories, but it's not like a student remembers, oh, this was on August 20th, or this was on November 15th that he did this, and you can't cross-reference that. But it seemed clear to me that it is clear to me that he committed misdemeanor and felony level offenses that were prosecutable and should have been referred to law enforcement, that were not, under a policy that basically said don't, and that he committed lower level offenses that could have flagged his record, not for law enforcement and gun buying purposes, but for the purpose of, does the student really belong at this school?
Right. Right.
But all of the incentives align to push or keep, however you want to phrase it, students like that in normal schools. And so you have this toxic mix where federal disability policy and eventually federally coerced, but in this case, just district-led discipline policy, put you in a position where you have potentially very dangerous students who shouldn't be in a traditional school, who are intentionally or indirectly intentionally not disciplined or treated appropriately, which leads to, as I wrote in the book, it leads to 1,000 tragedies a day that never make the news. And it led to this big tragedy on that one day that, frankly, I wish I could say it really moved the needle. It kind of did. The Trump administration rescinded the policy of the Office of Civil Rights that was pressuring schools to do this. But right now, the Biden administration is back in office. Catherine Lamon was Assistant Secretary of OCR, is Assistant Secretary of OCR, probably is pushing it again behind the scenes already. Can't quite find the receipts on that, but it was a temporary respite at best, and these policies are still. And I think we can expect them to be even more aggressively pushed into, any given school in America.
Right. Right. So we really haven't learned anything from this if we don't completely, revamp this or change it, to undo all of those things that create these incentives. I really think parents are unaware of this because, like I said, I knew a fair amount of the backstory that you just explained about the Promise program and so forth, but I haven't read your book, but I did follow along. And I remember saying at the time that this happened, I said, I bet we will find out that this kid should have been suspended 10 times over already, if not outright expelled. And sure enough. And the reason I say that is that right here in Charlotte, years ago, well before this ever happened, there was a murder locally of a small business owner, mattress store owner, and his wife, and it was a hit that was put out on him because he got some other people or somebody arrested who was kind of the head of some gang, and because they robbed his store, and he had evidence, and he turned it in, and he got them arrested, and the kids who carried out the hit were high school students who were recruited on the campus of South Mecklenburg High School. And each and every one of these students was a student who shouldn't have been at that school. Like, they should have been long gone from that school. And in several cases, they were over 18. They were on their 6th or 7th year of high school. I mean, it was like a bad novel. And a woman I knew did some of her own investigation, and she went and talked to the resource officer, and she just kind of dug around on her own and found out that they had, it was almost like a conspiracy, that the administration of the school had taken steps to hide everything they could possibly hide about these individuals for years to keep them in the school. And then it resulted in the death of this person. They should have been in jail. They certainly shouldn't have been at the school.
And those administrators have every incentive to, right? And this gets to, I think, part of why parents just don't understand it, or it's taken a long time for parents to start to understand it. I think that more and more are, and even more will, because
Right.
you look at your teachers, mostly your principals also, and they seem like good people, and they
Right.
mostly are. You know, the bad actors that get attention on social media aren't your median teacher or your median principal.
Right.
But your median teacher, especially your median principal, is a bureaucratic official operating within a system that has incentives. And
Hmm.
those incentives are not primarily, and frankly, sometimes not really at all, responsive to the desires of the community and of the parents. They're responsive to all sorts of other uh, assumptions that are affected through kind of bureaucratic implementation. And
Hmm.
those principals were kind of doing the job they were supposed to do by doing that. I mean, you know, they weren't
Right.
doing the right thing from a moral perspective, but from a professional perspective, they were doing the prudent thing. And that's why I said in the Parkland book that, you know, you can't even call what happened a failure because everybody did what they were supposed to do.
Right. Right.
Everybody acted the way that they were basically supposed to act, and this was the result. And you know, I also said, and it applies to the case you're mentioning, it applies to thousands of other cases that never make the news. You know, normal, good human beings don't make decisions that bad if it's just up to them.
Right.
Or if when they turn around, they're thinking about the parents behind their shoulder.
Right.
They make these decisions because when they turn around, it's not the parents behind the shoulder. It's
Right.
a bureaucrat with a spreadsheet, sometimes with direct financial, sometimes with indirect financial incentives aligned behind that. And that's how the system operates.
But I do think it would be fair to say that it's a failure in terms of central planning for
Mhm.
education across the whole country. So, in other words, if you're looking at the federal Department of Education, it really does highlight how problematic it is to allow bureaucrats far, far away
Mhm.
from a community to make blanket policy. I don't care what the motivation is. It could be the most pure motivation in the world. You just are too far away from things happening on the ground to make a one size fits all policies. This is what we want to see, or this is the outcome we want to see. Because if you back it out and you say, well, we're going to have a disparate outcome in terms of discipline, but we're not going to no one's going to get killed in our school. And I mean, like, in other words, if what would be acceptable, and instead of comparing and contrasting these two different outcomes and say, let's have that ethical debate, which would be a more desirable outcome: a violence-free campus where the students feel safe and they're able to pursue their academic pursuits, and you have a handful of kids who are in jail. They're just in jail. They're not going to be returning to school. They're gone. Versus, we don't send anybody to jail, but kids are getting beat up in the hallway.
Well, and ultimately, we probably, I mean, it's an empirical thing, but we might be sending more kids to jail in the long run, right? I
And
mean,
well,
I've
right, because
spoken
we're
to
not
so
looking
many.
at the moral hazard associated with teaching a child. And I talk about this on the channel all the time. There are lessons we teach without teaching. In other words, like, they don't happen in the classroom. Kids pick up on what our standards are, what we, they see what the incentives of the administrators are, and
Mhm.
they start learning how to game the system. They're not stupid. And
No,
so,
yeah.
and especially, like I said, in this case where the gang was literally recruiting from within the school because it was like very desirable to do it. Like, we'll just keep recruiting younger and younger because they're minors. They won't go to prison for the same amount of time as the kids who were the adults. They'd age out and they'd move on to other kids. And they had a whole recruiting system going on for their gang within the school. And they were practically untouchable. There were kids who would just show up at the school for that purpose and then leave, and they would never get suspended. So, they figure out these rules. They learn how to navigate this. And the kids were just there trying to get an education, or they're learning, I can't trust the adults. They don't really mean what they say about caring about me and what happens to me. And there's a whole lot of mistrust. And like you said, ultimately, the kid who might have gone to juvie and gotten the help they needed and dealt with it before they became a hardened felon didn't. And
Mhm.
instead, they're like, I got away with it. I got away with this. I got away with that. Next thing you know, they commit murder.
Yeah.
So,
And you were 100% on point to kind of begin what you said by speaking about the failures of central planning and the inevitable failures of central planning, right? And intentions don't really matter in politics and policy. Interpersonally, they do. It matters if I have good intentions towards you as a human being,
Right.
but ultimately, what actually happens because of what you do is what matters. And
Right.
I'm sure that the people who set up this disparate impact based discipline reform structure thought that they were doing a good thing. It'd be strange if they didn't. Nobody
Right. gets
gets to school to like, I'm going to mess up kids and mess up things. But the assumption was that the disparity was a product of teacher or institutional racism. And if you
Right.
think about the scope of the disparity, and it's a big disparity, and it has
Mhm.
like many causes. If you think that it's mostly or possibly even all the teacher's fault, well, then you should not trust the teacher. I mean,
Right.
geez, teachers are racist, and if you don't trust, and if that gets down, which it does, then what then happens? And I'm sure you've heard parents and teachers say this to you 1,000 times before. You know, a teacher will send a student to the principal's office, and the teacher will get in trouble for doing it
Of
because
course.
the assumption is that the teacher was wrong to do that. And that
Right.
is not the principal's natural assumption, but that is the assumption that he has been institutionally socialized to hold. And then the
Right.
students know that. They know where the line is. And, even in far less, hard cases than what you're talking about, there are always going to be some kids who push the envelope. They want to know where
Sure.
the limits are. They want to go right up to the limit.
That's a
Farther the limit,
natural adolescent thing to do anyway.
yeah, farther the limit
That's
is, more they'll go. And
yeah.
if and when they hear that the reason why they're being disciplined for the misbehavior is because their teacher is racist, and to the extent that they believe that, that's just one of the most perverted moral messages you could ever send to a young man or woman.
Right.
It will make them think the entire society is unfair. It will make the entire locus of whatever problems they have in their life be cast outwards rather than be a subject
Mhm.
for internal reflection. And you're putting them, that is the school to prison pipeline, in my opinion, right? I mean, the fact that students who get suspended disproportionately drop out, disproportionately get arrested later, that's all statistical noise, almost all statistical noise, all but certainly. But
Right.
sending a student the message that your behavior is because the system is racist couldn't be a more perfect recipe for leading a child down a very dark road in life.
And we're doing it younger and younger.
And
So
in more and more
whereas
ways.
yeah, and so I wanted to talk about that because the question I get a lot is what project is public education in America working on right now? Because, parents assume they're sending their kids to school each day to learn math and to learn to read and learn history and learn civics and learn, science, things like that. And increasingly, I'm having to tell them, actually, it's my impression they're working on a completely different project than that. That's actually not their first priority. And so I have some ideas about what I think they're working on, but what do you're immersed in this every day. What is their priority right now? Because it doesn't appear to be academic excellence, certainly not individual academic excellence, but it doesn't even appear to be societal academic excellence. Like if there could be such a thing.
Right. I mean, so it's important to be particular about, or to be as particular as we can about, who they are when we say they. And I'm not saying you shouldn't say they. They do exist, but who are they and what do they mean?
Okay, let's talk about it in terms of the educators at the ed school level who are teaching the teachers and defining like pedagogical standards and so forth, and then they're advising state boards of education, the federal department of education, the educators with the capital E, who have
Mhm.
PhD after their name, and who are the ones that the officials, policymakers, money spenders, and so forth turn to and say, what should we be doing in our K-12 public system? That's the they that I'm talking about.
And that is a good they to pinpoint. I was going to, and I'm glad that you did. I was going to pinpoint another they actually, but I
Oh,
think
okay.
I think I can put the two together.
Okay, great.
So, I think as we discussed, more and more parents are having the sense that like my school board member doesn't really control anything, and I don't really
Because
have
they
a voice.
don't.
And then the question is, well, who does control? Who does have the power? And the answer is part what you said, and I'll circle back to that, or I'll try to. But it's also partly this very strange, not quite amorphous, but educrat blob, right? There is the Department of Education, the National School Boards Association, and we've seen their attack. There are the teachers' unions. There are all of these, foundation-funded advocacy and reform organizations. And I think what might be put on ESSA is what part of the phenomena that might be put on ESSA is also a little bit misplaced from the real locus of the turn, which was you had this kind of battle between education reform and the kind of the unions for 2000 to 2015 over No Child Left Behind, until it kind of fell to a mutually exhausted draw. Nothing that very little that the reformers did really did what they expected it to do. The unions didn't really stop them from being able to do it either. And you have a kind of effectively an industrial complex built around a bureaucratic complex that around the time that ESSA was passed and around the time Trump was elected and ever increasingly more, was wondering, well, maybe we had the wrong theory of action. Maybe the theory of action that, we know the policies to raise reading and math, and we know the ways to reform school practices to make them more efficient. Well, maybe that wasn't the problem at all. Maybe the problem was that these school districts were racist, and these teachers were racist, and these whole institutions were racist. And so right around the time that these two forces had kind of fought to a draw was the exact same time that, you can see kind of like in the New York Times graphs that have been done, these critical race theory words that weren't called CRT at the time, but in retrospect, with more education, we know where they come from, we know what they mean. It offered a very nice diagnosis that rationalizes failure and says, well, it wasn't that your ideas were wrong or that you didn't implement them well. It was that the problem was cultural. And so you need to fix the cultural problem. This also happens to dovetail entirely, pretty perfectly with the they that you identified, which are the educators of the capital E, the people who teach our teachers. And it's almost hard to figure out the right way to say it, but they're broadly unconscious neo-Marxists, right? I mean, Gloria Ladson-Billings is now the second most influential education professor in America. She was the one who brought critical race theory to education, packaged it broadly as culturally responsive pedagogy, and it fit pretty nicely into the overall sphere of educators with a capital E. The American Education Research Association made Bill Ayers a VP of curriculum, I think, in maybe 2007. I can't remember the exact year. And Bill Ayers was actually a domestic terrorist. He actually, or allegedly actually a domestic terrorist. I don't want to run afoul of anything, but leader of the Weathermen Underground, which then became the Weather Underground because we have to be inclusive. And that's an organization that is alleged to have planned all sorts of bombings domestically for the purpose of advancing the cause of Marxism in the United States. And yet somehow a man like that gets elected to a position within the American Educational Research Association. And so that is kind of the culture of education schools has for a long time been.
Well, and Angela Davis is pretty big too.
Angela Davis is very big too. And these people, people like them who I think most moms, most dads, when they hear, wait, somebody who allegedly bought a shotgun that was used in a kidnapping that killed a judge, that's somebody who is just kind of commonly thought about as a hero by the people who teach my teachers. It's almost too horrifying to think about, but their theory of education, even without the harder edge to it, which I think, I don't know, I haven't been able to trace precisely when the edge became as hard as it is today. But it's for a long time been a softer project wherein education is viewed as a way to shape democracy, going all the way back to John Dewey, in a way that is no longer, schools as a way for communities and parents to partner with democratically elected officials to help pass down their traditions, their values, their principles, but rather a way to recreate and create new values and new traditions and new principles. And so I think that there's a lot of they, either the kind of educrat blob or the educators with a capital E, are bought in to some theory of education for social change. and we should be careful to not paint with too broad of a brush and tar them all as Bill Ayers types. But if you view education as a project for social change and progress, and you are not particular as to what that change should be and what that progress looks like, then you risk getting to a situation where you are right now, where it frequently seems like schools might be acting, although I don't believe it to be the wishes of many teachers or principals, but schools might be acting effectively to create a new morality that is inherently oppositional to the morality the parents might want their children to pursue. And you're seeing a kind of a de-emphasis on reading and math and the nuts and bolts, and a newer emphasis on social emotional learning, which is much more feelings-based, attitudes-based, mindsets-based. That again is a case where, you know, a lot more, we could talk about that for hours, and perhaps we shouldn't talk about a lot of it for now. But
well, today is National Social Emotional Learning Day.
I actually believe, and I might be mistaken, I believe it's International Social
Emotional Learning Day. What does that even look like? I mean, it's like, and you know, I still run into people every day online, obviously, but who will say, "What is social emotional learning?" They're like, "What do you mean? What is this?" And it's like, I just think, oh God, where do I even begin? I have described it as kind of like an operating system. So if you have, you know, all the other critical theories, a critical race theory and gender theory and intersectional theory, all that as software applications, if you will, they kind of run on the operating system of SEL. That's how I've explained it. And when people say, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, before let's say 2017, because that's when Castle kind of changed. Castle's the big company. The idea was that students learned best if they were, you know, socially, emotionally able to function within the classroom, and they understood how to get along with other people, listen to the teacher, and so forth. So there's sort of social emotional component to learning. You're not going to be receptive to the learning if you're not in the right headspace. But it was primarily reactive. In other words, if a student's having trouble, we approach the student individually, work at certain exercises and things with them, possibly with the help of the school counselor, and we deal with it. It was also individualized. So in other words, we weren't approaching the whole class at the same time. It was, you know, the kid who has the issue, we deal with that. And usually, again, it was something the parent knew about or the school counselor was knowing about, and there was a plan put in place and so forth. To the extent it was dealt with in the classroom, with all the students, it might have been like, these are our rules and this is how we play nice with each other. And, you know, it wasn't really described as SEL time. It was just, this is how we get along with each other. And we have now moved to all the way to something called transformational SEL now, where we're not only not reactive, we're proactive. And the goal is to make sure the student understands that they are not a unique individual, but are in fact made up of all these identities, and that their focus is external. Their focus is on the collective good. Their focus is on action, and they are no longer passive in any way emotionally. They have to be actively engaged emotionally in the community, and that is a duty. It's not just something that, you know, is desirable. It's a duty. Am I accurately describing this?
You are accurately describing it, pretty accurately describing it. I would just, you know, I think it'd be best to just add another layer of kind of institutional, historical.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot more to it, but I just want to make sure people understand it's big.
Oh, it's big. I mean, the simplest way that it could be described, I think the parents would start to get, is kind of Common Core 2.0 whole child edition, right? Because, I mean, part of the theory as to why SEL, the theory on which SEL was publicly sold and broadly bought, and I'm using the word sold and bought for a reason, was that during the No Child Left Behind and pre-ESSA era, schools focus too much on just reading, just math, and schools are broader institutions. They are character-forming institutions, right? And we kind of lost track of that for a lot of reasons. And we should get back to focusing on character and development and social and emotional skills. And that's not wrong. The issue, I mean, there are hours could be spent on this, but to put it succinctly, the issue is that even before the transformative shift, one of my kind of friends and colleagues, Jay Green, wrote an excellent article for the American Enterprise Institute a couple years ago, pointing out that, hey, there's kind of like a one-to-one between like Aristotelian virtues and social emotional learning competencies, except that Aristotelian virtues have virtue to them, right? They have a vision of what a person is supposed to be. And this SEL 1.0, up until the transformative shift, didn't really have that vision. It was a neutral competency-based framework. And the problem with, moral neutrality is that nature abhors a vacuum in all things. It's hard to have a moral or have an ethos that doesn't have a core morality. And for whatever reason, and I'm still exploring theories on this, and so I don't want to come to a conclusion, that vacuum was filled, and that vacuum was filled by the transformative shift, which when you read the document, you can see all of these terms that 3 years ago, most people wouldn't know: intersectional, culturally based, gender identity, all of these terms that most people didn't know what they meant 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And now most people are starting to know what they mean. And when people realize that it can be this operating system, as you describe, and that carried within this operating system is this new moral content, and that it's this new moral content that you're already kind of familiar with, but in some ways you might not have scratched the surface on, and that the whole school is buying into this program designed for the whole child, that has a moral valence that might not be yours, might run contrary to yours, and that it is, as an industry, ramping up exponentially. There was some Education Week article, and I can't remember the exact numbers, so I don't want to be quoted direct. I don't want to say directly, but something on the order of like 5 years ago, I think it was around the order of $300 million per year. And at the last data point collection, it was $750 million a year. And it's growing. I mean, it will probably soon be a more than billion, if not potentially even multi-billion dollar industry.
The president just said today, he was proud to claim $120 billion put towards SEL.
Yeah, I saw that. I need to read that. A lot of
money.
Oh, that's all. It's so much money, and it's enough money that it makes what engendered the Common Core look like peanuts, right? The Common Core was sold to America on a fraction of $4.35 billion. And then, maybe that's part of the reason it was implemented so badly.
And the ARPA funds that I understand, most of the ARPA fund grants are going towards SEL as well.
I don't know most, but a substantial portion of it. Yeah.
They're saying because of COVID, mental health, and all kinds of things so it'll end up, I mean, mental health, it ends up all kind of falling under SEL.
Well, and that's another big issue with SEL, and one that my colleague Robert Pendicio wrote a great essay or a great report for AEI on, is it kind of basically asks the teacher to act as a unlicensed therapist, which I don't think many teachers really want to do, frankly. And no offense to teachers, I don't think many teachers can do well. And so if they're asked to do something that they can't do that well, and they're given a clear, easy buzzword shorthand for how to do it, then that's what they'll do. But then what happens when the buzzword becomes culturally responsive, which is, redefinition synonym for critical race theory, when it becomes gender affirming, which is a redefinition for gender identity ideology, then, all health really assumes a knowledge of what a healthy body, what a healthy mind, a healthy soul is. And it's very difficult to look at the people who I think have the most power in our schools and to conclude that they really know what a truly healthy human being is.
Right. Well, and it's also not what I think parents, it's not the social contract parents think they have with the school. So that's why I asked about what project are they working on, because I think the majority of parents are still laboring under the delusion that there's this social contract that they drop their kid at the school and that school will not violate certain boundaries. And the school will teach their kid how to do basic things and then, protect them from harm and send them home. And what is happening increasingly is the schools are becoming, they're parenting the children, but it's not like they're taking the wishes of the parents and saying, hey, I'm going to do my best to be you. They've come up with a new version of parenting that is defined by all of the stuff we've just discussed, right? The, culturally relevant. They've said a proper child, an anti-racist child, a truly inclusive child, an equitable child, whatever the definition of the perfect child is in their ideology mishmash, needs to be parented this way. The parents at home are not going to do it right. So we're going to do that's the whole child. That's what I hear is we're going to parent them so they become the children we think they should be, not what you thought they should be, not what you hope they should be, not even what they hope they should be, but what we, this group of supposed experts, think they should be. And I'm trying to explain to parents that if that's not what you want, if you don't actually believe that they have the right idea, you might want to get involved because they do believe that they have the right idea and you don't.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, and I really like how you keep on going back to the word social contract, right? Because the original social contract of America believed that the family was the primary pre-political unit, and that
Right.
there is no role for the state to enter into the family except in extreme cases of abuse,
Right.
unless it is in accordance with the wishes of the family. And part of the reason public education spread as widely and effectively as it did in education is because parents trusted and had reason to trust that their communities that they handed their children over to for part of the day would be partnering with them, would be doing their will. But as we've been discussing, and as I think parents are really starting to get, and then the full realization may take more time yet, but I think we're getting there. If it's not really you who has direct control over your school, but it's really this other group that very clearly, or this other entity, institutions that clearly has
The
a vision,
blob. Right.
blob, that clearly has like a collective vision of sorts that informs how it's operated, then they're no longer acting in loco parentis. They're not acting in your
Right.
place, they're acting in their place. And
Exactly.
they are quite possibly acting against you, and against your wishes for your child.
I would say in many cases, parents would say that.
Mhm.
I can speak as a parent whose children were in public school up until right before the pandemic. That was the case. It absolutely explicitly was the case. And even though I was a very involved parent, I even volunteer taught in the school. It really didn't matter. And so that kind of brings me to my next and probably final question, because I know you've got a tight schedule. I like to wrap up my videos with something constructive, something that can give the audience a direction. And it's not just all bad news. And it's been challenging for me because I really do believe that the method of going to the school board and complaining to the school board is ineffective. I think the role of the local school board has been reduced from what it was decades ago. Parents haven't really gotten that memo, like they don't really realize, and different states have different levels of power. But for the most part, as you pointed out, you've got this kind of, educrat kind of blob. You've got the teachers unions. You've got extraordinarily powerful influences that make this a David and Goliath situation on steroids. And so I've been telling parents, for your child, if you're seeing these things in your school and you don't have a good relationship with your teachers and the principals, and where you feel like I can actually just make face-to-face change, like I can go in and keep eyes on this, and what I see is okay. It's not so bad yet. You can't reform this in time for your child. Like, you may need to make other arrangements, is what I've been saying, whether it's homeschool, whether it's some version of private or parochial, whether it's form of micro school or, something. And if you want to still work on the project of education reform after that, triage your kid first, like that you
Right.
aren't going to fix it in time for your kid. What else can they do, though? Is there anything that parents can focus on that could make for meaningful change, or are they just going to have to get out?
I mean, it depends on where you are, right? I mean, the going to the school board meetings, the talking to the principals, talking to the teachers, I wouldn't write that off everywhere, right? I think there are probably many school districts where this has been, as the other side says, unconsciously bought, right? And that there are going to be districts where school board members, superintendents, principals, if confronted cordially but aggressively with facts and argument and a strong case, might actually reconsider. That's not going to be everywhere, though. It might not even be most places at this point. And their parents need to realize, my colleague Robert Medicio wrote a great article on Commentary a couple months ago where he kind of cribbed off of the famous Hemingway line, how did schools go woke? Well, two ways: slowly and then suddenly.
Right.
This was the state of affairs. I think it appears to many parents as though it kind of just all happened yesterday. But it was really just the final shoe that dropped yesterday. It's maybe not the best metaphor, but that's really when the switch was flipped. But the wiring had already been set within the house, and it had been constructed over the course of decades.
Right.
And ultimately, the project of restoring the traditional form of education that Americans agreed to and built through a proper social contract is a long construction process in itself. And so for parents who find themselves in a school district where they start hearing about culturally responsive education, anti-racist, gender identity stuff, and they don't like it, and they talk to their principal, talk to their superintendent, school board members, they get the cold shoulder. You're not going to change that in the next couple of years. We could talk for hours about the policies and structures and organizations that need to be built to change it in 10 to 15 years, but it's not going to change in the next 2 to 5 in districts like that. And I wish that there were better advice than the kind of advice that you gave, which is look for other options. But maybe, I brought up his name in his writings. He's a great man. You should try to have him on the show at some point. But Robert Pendicio had a piece up today on.
Maybe you can put in a good word for me, because I reached out to him once and I didn't get an answer.
Oh yeah, I'll put in a good word on Great Hearts Academy's online micro schools. They're a classical school system, charter school network. I think they might have 17, 19,000 students. I've visited the schools. They're beautiful. They teach Shakespeare. The Bible is literature, Locke, Aristotle. I mean, everything that I think most parents really want their kids to be taught, classical education. And they are developing, and I think soon to launch, a kind of private school project, not always necessarily brick and mortar private schools, but that can be delivered at $5,000 a year. Right. And I think that's something that could be scraped together by parents who are sufficiently concerned and parents who really want their child's soul to be, cultivated as beautifully as possible. And the hope is that, if you look, that the market is responding, will respond, and then it will only respond as much as parents choose. And I think, the other dark and bright note, maybe to wrap this all up on, is I fear, and I've haven't lived long enough to really know, but I fear that part of the reason that schools are stepping in to what is traditionally parental zone is that they genuinely, earnestly, and altruistically, with good intentions, feel like there's a void there, and that they need to fill the void because the parents aren't. And it can sound presumptuous to claim that, but there might be more truth to that than we're comfortable admitting. And parents need to realize that they have the fundamental right and responsibility to direct the education of their children. And to the extent that they fulfill that right, their kid will get the education that they want their kid to get. And the extent that they don't, then their child will not. And so it really, they're not trapped. There are other options. And if you have the will, you can find the way.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think I'm glad you made that point, because it's a fine line. I think parents in the last couple of years have gotten a bad rap. I think they like too much has been put on them as far as, hey, stay home and don't go to work and see to your kids' education and, all that. But now shut up, so there's been a lot of shade thrown at parents that I think was undeserved. But as you
Mhm.
pointed out, we parents need to recognize that just because programs are offered, free lunch, free, breakfast, before care, after care, all these kinds of things, that to the extent that you hand your child over more and more and more to the school, or look to the school to do more for you in terms of hours of the day, don't really be surprised if they do that. If they pick that baton up and run with it. So it seems convenient, but what are you giving up?
Mhm.
Sort of like that's your parenting time too. So I think it's worth noting, and it's probably something that we all should seriously consider, not just what kind of education do I want my child to have, but how much of that is my responsibility ultimately. And it's
Mhm.
a lot more than probably most people have thought in recent years. So hopefully there'll be some balance there.
Yeah.
Um, but I really have to thank you for coming in and spending the time with me. I know, we probably could go into any one of these down any one of these rabbit holes for hours. And I would love to pick your brain more, possibly in another show in the future, about critical race theory in particular. But I think we did a pretty good job of giving people a survey of this. I hope everybody will consider going out and checking out the Why Meadow Died book, because you'll get a lot more detail as far as these policies and how they affect discipline in the schools and danger in the schools. And as Max pointed out, they probably haven't changed all that much. There's some things that have changed, but I don't think there's been a wholesale learning from this.
If
And you
anything,
might
it's
want
gotten
to,
worse.
I'm sorry?
I said, if anything, I think it's gotten more aggressive and
Yeah.
worse.
Well, especially with the, critical theories that have invaded the schools, because we now have more of this disparate, outcome scrutiny and all kinds of stuff. So thank you very, very much. Thanks to everybody who came. The replay will be up immediately. Please consider liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing to the channel. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Eb.